Hi, and welcome to another episode of Condemned and Happy, a podcast exploring religious trauma. Today's topic is the doctrine of discovery and racism. Kim, can you tell us what the doctrine of discovery is?
Yeah. And if listeners want to learn more about this doctrine, and here I have it in air quotes, Google Doctrine of Discovery and Papal Bulls. A papal bull is spelled like the animal, Bull. And basically what a papal bull means is it's a decree issued by the Pope. Any decree issued by the Pope becomes church law. The first papal bull about discovery was issued in 1452. The next one was issued in 1455, and the final one was issued in 1493. So these three decrees became Christian law in colonizing and exploring the non-Christian world. And by that, I mean the non-white European Christian world. At this time in European history, you have a lot of nationalism starting, not the same way that we see it today, but there was a sense of really anti-Semitic thoughts and seeing people who were non-Christian as less than. These decrees essentially allowed the colonizing armies of Europeans to seize the land, especially in Africa and in the Americas, and to enslave the population of those people in those lands in perpetuity, which means forever. So this is a white supremacist type mindset, and it sees Native Americans, it sees people from, all over the Americas as second class and as not worthy, dehumanizes them. So the people could evangelize and convert the indigenous populations, but in the eyes of the church and in church law, as non-Europeans and non-white people, they were forever considered second-class citizens. Now, this law gets carried into the U.S., and it gets carried into U.S. Protestantism as well as U.S. Catholicism. So NPR did a really good article on this because on March 30th, 2023, Catholic Church repudiated this doctrine and basically said the mindset behind this doctrine is no longer part of Catholicism. And so it's being exorcised out of Catholicism. The challenge with this is that as late as 2005, the US Supreme Court has used this doctrine to continue an idea that started in 1823 that Native Americans could occupy their land, but not own it. And because of that occupation attitude, they had the rights to above the land, but not necessarily mineral rights if there was minerals on their lands. So like oil, mining, all of that becomes an issue. The attitude of white superiority and white ownership of the land, it carried into some of our religious practices. The fact that it's not until 2023 that the Catholic Church renounces this doctrine says a lot. And I can't just blame the Catholic Church. The Lutheran Church, I think, renounced it in 2016. So not much sooner. And I think from my racism training courses that the first renunciation was the UCC in 2013.
Oh, wow.
So it's only the late 2000s, and it's about a dozen to 2 dozen Protestant bodies and the Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches that have renounced this doctrine. So in some places, it still has its legacy, in that, we're trying to get rid of this idea of racial superiority. That really harmed a lot of people over the last 500 years or more.
Yeah. Why is it important that religious groups and church bodies repudiate this doctrine?
In my opinion, it's really important that we do this to start the work of racial reconciliation and healing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important too to point it out that
Mm-hmm.
Christianity doesn't start out as a nationalistic movement.
Mm-hmm.
Its beginning is not in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Its beginning is the Middle East. In the Middle East, no one racial group was ever deemed superior or favorable or favored by God other than the Israelites. But when Christianity starts, it doesn't say, it doesn't start as this hierarchical, racialized religious group. There are cultural issues that they're facing in the early church
Mm-hmm.
because you have tensions between Jews and non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
That whole question of do Gentiles, which is a non-Jew, need to
Mm-hmm.
convert to Judaism before converting to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And as an adult, that conversion involved circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
that's not a pleasant way to
Yeah.
convert. There were free people and non-free people in these congregations.
Mm-hmm.
And some, if you were a citizen of Rome, you had rights, essentially a free person. But if you were not a citizen of Rome, you didn't have any rights.
Mm-hmm.
So Christianity kind of starts in this really oppressed system. Many of the churches are more diverse in some ways than they are now because there wasn't a hierarchical order at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Right after Christ, you have some of the churches are struggling with cultural and social traditions by upending them
Mm-hmm.
and exploring new social norms for women and men. And some are getting resistance to that. Change always brings resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so not all of the communities succeed and thrive, and not all the cultural norms are overturned at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So in today's day, with the rise of Christian nationalism, it's really important to understand that Christianity is not native to the US.
Mm-hmm.
It's not native to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That people from Israel, who now consider themselves Palestinians, their ancestors are modern day citizens of Gaza Strip and Palestine or the West Bank. Their ancestors, and they like to remind us of this, left their homes to come out and evangelize to us white people and to Asia and to Northern Africa and throughout that Mediterranean Sea. So it's important to understand this. It's important to understand that when they're coming and evangelizing, they're not bringing racism with them. They're not bringing that idea. It's also important when you look at the rise of Christian nationalism to understand that the US is not the new Israel. I know there are some groups that say that. There's nothing in the Bible that says that.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity's birthplace is the Middle East. It's the only indigenous religion in Israel because Abram did not live in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The land was promised to him, yes, but Christianity is its birth there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also important to understand that the people in the Bible are not white.
Mm-hmm.
They're not European. We have a mention of some Europeans in the Bible. They're called Romans, and they're the bad guys. So, it's something to keep in mind that, this Christian history that many people are taught, and sometimes in the homeschool and sometimes in conservative churches, is not very accurate.
Mm-hmm.
What we see then is in the 14th, which historians would call the 15th century, in the 1400s, we see this rise of white supremacy and it getting pushed into Christianity. And as these European countries are competing with each other about colonizing the world, they see themselves as superior.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see then is Christianity being turned to a weapon of trauma and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
There is plenty of people who have written about how colonization has harmed the lands and the people in those areas, and that Definitely Africa, because colonization brought not only Europeans into that area, but slavery
Hmm.
and the slave trade. The America continents, both, we had severe diseases that
Hmm.
inflicted upon Native Americans who, by contact with Europeans,
Hmm.
and much of the genocide that
Hmm.
has happened in the Native American communities was sanctioned by the church.
Yeah.
The undermining of treaties, because
Hmm.
this gets into American law, it becomes
Hmm.
precedent. And
Hmm.
so it becomes this thing of, well, we've always done it this way, so we're going to keep
Yeah.
seeing that. And that just really treats Native Americans as if they are children and can't manage the land, which they do better than we do, in my opinion.
Hmm.
So this is really created a legacy of second-class
Hmm.
citizenship by some Americans, so some white Americans, towards people who are African descent, Asian descent,
Hmm.
and Hispanic and
Hmm.
Native American. It becomes a way of justifying owning of persons
Hmm.
and the dehumanizing of slaves and minorities. I think it's the religious roots of white supremacy.
Hmm.
I don't think many people are very familiar with this doctrine. I know I had to look it up because it wasn't explicitly taught to me that I can remember.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that the people 500 years ago didn't know about it and didn't embed it in
Yeah.
culture and in our culture and in our how we're enculturated in our culture
Hmm.
and in our laws. And so I think it was really important to look at this and see this, because slavery is a legacy that is sometimes considered America's original sin,
Hmm.
or the US's original sin.
Hmm.
Definitely Native Americans, you mentioned growing up near a boarding house for Native Americans, and the
Hmm.
crimes that were done to those children
Yeah.
is horrific.
Yep.
And many of the people running those communities were quote unquote Christian,
Yeah.
either Catholic or Lutheran. I mean,
Hmm.
no Protestant or Roman Catholic denomination's hands are clean in this. And again, when you see people as second class or as animals or as not as good as you, it becomes a way in which great harm and trauma can be inflicted and is inflicted on others. I think some of this, even though if it's not directly taught, becomes some of the attitude you have in slaveholding
Hmm.
versions of Christianity, because that definitely took a while. It wasn't just the North that opposed holding of slaves. It was really people
Yeah.
kind of looking at this North and South and going, wait, why are we doing this? These are people.
Yeah.
And so I also think this has some roots in systemic racism because it's legalized.
Hmm.
And because it's legalized, that's what systemic racism is essentially, is the rules preventing people from having equal access to ownership of land. There was a time in our country where we imported people from China to build
Yeah.
the railroad, transcontinental railroad, but they weren't allowed to own land.
Yep.
And we've done that with Native Americans. And that was illegal.
Hmm.
So that's what systemic racism has in its legacy, and then it keeps, by not being able to own land or build wealth, that keeps people in these systems of poverty and trauma, reinforces stereotypes like, oh, well, they can't be handled, they can't handle
Hmm.
themselves. And it reinforces this idea that as white people, we have to be their savior, or we
Hmm.
have to ignore what they want because they
Yeah.
can't handle it anyway. And that's very problematic.
I think like my experience of coming to understand that systemic racism existed and that sort of concept of recognizing that we don't all experience the same outcomes or the same treatment kind of starts with like police violence
Mm,
and interactions with law enforcement. When I first started driving and things like that, I was never 100% on the right side of the law, if you will. I drove
mhm.
poorly maintained vehicles at times,
Do you have the
and
family lead foot disease?
did have a tendency to drive fast. And I also did not have a great grasp of the world I lived in, what people wanted from you, how to navigate interactions with people. As a white man dealing with mostly white male cops, I look back and I realize that like I had it really easy, and that there were a lot of interactions where I foolishly didn't know any better and things could have gone much more south. And as a young person on the internet in the early 2000s, before there was a lot of filters and
Mhm.
stuff, growing up in the era, you saw a lot of the videos that came out of poor interactions with cops when it came to African American people. It was very eye opening. Like I recognized that, like, oh, I misheard a cop and it was fine. I acted in a way that would have been considered suspicious because I didn't know any better, and it was fine. The cop probably saw me as a younger version of themselves,
Right.
or didn't care, and I got a lot of breaks
Yeah.
given my behavior. So starting to see those videos come out, and seeing how you could, as a black person, do everything right in the interaction and still have a really negative outcome was very eye-opening. It was very, well, this isn't right. Why does this exist?
Uh,
But the more uncomfortable thing about it was when you went to talk about it, the
Yes.
white people that I lived with or that I went to church with were like, well, it was their fault. It was their
Yes.
fault that they had a bad outcome. Just the simple act of saying, well, maybe not. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe something else was like, I mean, I literally had this conversation with my pastor at the time where I was like, well, obviously not all of these incidences are the people involved's fault. And he's like, what? Do you think I'm racist? That was his response to that question. It took me back. It was like, I never said you were racist. I never said anything to that effect. Just the idea that, well, maybe our cops aren't perfect.
Yeah.
Maybe, maybe there's some improvement that needs to happen. Maybe there's some expanding of our worldview, was a challenge. And that was really uncomfortable. Looking back, as having studied this topic a lot more, I was like, well, yeah, you are racist. You
Yeah.
said it, thou sayest. Is it, but it was like, I never said that. Like, it was very uncomfortable. And this uncomfortability around, the videos that I saw online and my experience with the cops and the world in general, and the blame that was put on people of color for something that was clearly not their fault,
Yep.
was really uncomfortable. And it made me question the system that the religion and the system that I was experiencing or living in. And similarly, around that time, we have the Colin Kaepernick kneeling thing that happened. Tim Tebow had happened. He had knelt after, that was like a big celebrated thing. He was like, oh, this is, we love this guy. He's our guy,
Right.
bringing religion into football like he did.
Yep.
And then Colin Kaepernick comes out and kneels. And all the people I'm going to church with are like, this is evil. This guy is bad. This is against, veterans. And it was really, really bizarre because, you know, first off, kneeling is a more respectful
Yeah.
attitude to take than standing. And all of the people that were saying this all believed there was things wrong with America that needed to change.
Hmm.
They all believed that they had that persecution complex where that at some point America would rise up against Christ and they'd all be imprisoned and beaten for believing in Christ. Yet here they were lambasting somebody for daring to stand up and say that, maybe America had some improvements it needed to make. Criticizing someone for taking the attitude that they should have been taking when they prayed, when
Yeah.
they spoke to God, it was like, well, yeah, if you look at the videos that I'm seeing coming out on the internet of police interactions, there are some problems.
Yeah.
Not every situation is a problem, but there are some real problems. And if there's one problem, we should fix it, right? This is unfair. And the refusal to acknowledge that there is a problem and to shoot the messenger and to mock the messenger and to make the messenger out to be evil and make it about themselves. I mean, do we really want to start talking about how negatively we've treated African American veterans and how we've abused those people that have served our country and taken, not treated them very well? I mean, you just made it about, something else that it wasn't about. And that was just really uncomfortable. The fact that like it was seen as controversial and a problem to like say, well, maybe racism exists. Maybe we should do something. Maybe we should pray. Maybe we should support people that are praying. Maybe we should talk about it. Made me really uncomfortable and start asking questions.
Yeah.
It was like, well, as a northerner and a Christian at the time, it's like, well, this is something we got right. We stood for it. We think about like abolitionists that like stood up and made a change and really changed the world for the better at their time. Like, why aren't we celebrating this? Why aren't we continuing to talk about it? Why aren't we doing more? And the fact that like it was like, well, it's controversial, we're staying away from it, we're criticizing this person, was just really uncomfortable and really was a big turnoff. And the fact that like I would have been called like liberal and socialist and communist for saying, hey, maybe we should kneel when we pledge to the flag. Maybe we should pray. Was like, well,
I'm
what's
laughing
wrong?
because those words are used
Yeah.
on the far right and the right wing for everything they disagree with.
Yes.
And those words have lost meaning. And it's like there's
Yes.
nothing wrong with being liberal
Yeah.
because it's liberals who got us unions and got
Yeah.
us 2 day, 2 weekends or 2 day weekend. And
Yeah.
yeah, let me talk a little bit about growing up in post the Civil War or Civil
Mm-hmm.
War. God, I'm not that old.
Civil rights.
Civil rights.
Yeah.
I think so. Growing up in Oregon, racism is different.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't very many people of color that are African American descended. There's more Asian,
Mm-hmm.
Japanese, various forms, Korean, Cambodian,
Mm-hmm.
and more Hispanic people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little different, though, and those nations are and there's indigenous populations, but again, I didn't grow up knowing many people who were Native American.
Mm.
Um, there wasn't that, they had reservations, and I don't know if
Yep.
they were stuck on them or what. I really didn't
Yeah.
do a deep dive into how Oregon treated people, Native peoples. But I started school. I went through most of primary education in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So graduated high school in the 90s, 1990. And my classmates who were Hispanic were more aware
Mm-hmm.
of racism than I was.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would hear from white people in my church is they didn't understand why so many of the migrants who were
Mm-hmm.
Hispanic at the time from Mexico would spend their money to get a satellite dish and watch so they could get news on their home. Like they didn't understand why people would do that. There was a lot of thought that the migrants just needed to shed their culture
Mm-hmm.
and their language, and they would be assimilated into American culture the way their
Mm.
ancestors were. And again, my grandfather, your great grandfather, came over at age 18 in 1922, and German descent, thick German accent,
Mm-hmm.
did really well in
Yeah.
the US. He didn't have any trouble. But what I didn't realize at the time and struggled to realize for a good 20 years or more was he could pass because he was white.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't understood the concept of passing. So
Mm.
that's when someone of African descent or Native American descent has enough white coloring to
Mm-hmm.
not look native. And in general, they can pass off for white and often get treated better.
Yep.
It took me a while. So one of the things that clicked for me was going on airplanes to visit people and not telling people what I do. Because when you
Mm.
tell people you're a pastor, they start apologizing for swearing around you and things get awkward.
Yeah.
It's an odd thing. Or
Mhm.
they start telling you your life story. And again, you're on vacation and want some boundaries, and I'm never going to
Yeah.
see this person again. Please don't just dump all your emotional baggage. Because they have this understanding that pastors are never on vacation. So so if I didn't want to face someone or have, and what most often happens were some old white guy saying, you can't be a pastor, you're a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I didn't want to face any of that, I just wouldn't tell people what I did. And that's when it finally dawned on me, like, oh, I can just ignore that. I don't have to tell people what my
Mm-hmm.
career is if I don't want to deal with their baggage and their microaggressions, particularly around telling me I can't be a woman,
Yeah.
or that women I don't believe, the funniest one is when people say, well, I don't believe in women pastors, and it's like, I'm standing right here. You're like,
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
didn't disappear. So that suddenly made me realize, a person of color can never change their skin tone,
Mm-hmm.
their hair coloring, or their eye shape.
Mm-hmm.
And those microaggressions of racism are always present for them, for
Mm-hmm.
nothing they can control. And that's when it suddenly dawned on me. It was like, oh, that's what they mean. Because we were about 16, and a couple of the girls I think we were in basketball. We also played soccer together and did track. So I don't know which real sports team it was, but we were in the locker room. I remember a few of the girls of Hispanic origin were saying to one of the other Hispanics, well, why are you only dating white men? And her comment was, well, this country doesn't give Hispanic men a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And at 16, she knew
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably 36 before I figured that out. But, and initially my response was one of, oh, that's not true, because my
Mm-hmm.
grandfather did fine. And that's when it hit, like, because growing up in the 70s, we were taught to be colorblind,
Mm-hmm.
to not describe people by the color of their skin, to not
Mm-hmm.
notice if someone had like a cleft palate or
Mm-hmm.
was born with a deformity or something.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't notice those things. You were taught not to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all fine and good in some ways, but it doesn't totally address what racism is
Mm-hmm.
and the racist attitudes of other people. So for many white people, they see themselves as, we're kind to everybody, we're not
Yeah.
racist. And that's where the systemic racism hits a huge roadblock, because no one has ever no one had ever told them, but do you know that your home values are increasing because you're in a predominantly white area, whereas a
Yep.
predominantly African American area is not? And
Yep.
did you know that when Eisenhower's road system was established for the highways, that certain communities, particular communities of colors that were thriving, got highways through their communities? And then that led to health problems. They didn't have access to health problems, but it cut access to those communities. That's a lot of what systematic racism is. It's the redlining. It's the not going to sell my home to a Black person. Those attitudes need to be addressed and need to be talked about in our churches. And there isn't often a time to talk about that in the churches. So I think with the election of President Obama, a lot of white people went, we're finally not racist.
Yeah.
And then you have this kickback with when 45 was elected. And that was a hard time because when Charlottesville happened, I had to sit with both my kids, and I had to tell my older one who identifies as Black, brown skinned, that she had to be careful because there are people in this country who would do her harm. And her comment was, well, won't the president do anything about it? And I'm like, no, sweetie.
Yeah.
He's enabling them. And she broke down in tears. Like she couldn't handle it. And then I had to tell my son, who is white, there are people in this country called white nationalists or who will say to you that being a white male is superior to everything else. And you need to resist that because, his comment was, well, will I be safe? And I said, yeah, you will be. They will want to recruit you to harm other people. Yeah. So it was hard to talk to the kids about that because I hadn't done a lot of research, like I was kind of hoping her biological family would kind of cue her in more and I wouldn't be have that responsibility. But I had to start learning a lot more and about traffic stops and talk to her like, as long as you're with me or Dad in public, our white privilege will protect you somewhat. But, as you start driving more, there are things you need to be aware of. As you are getting out of elementary school and not around us, there are things you need to be aware of about this area. And I don't think we were very cued in because I got people who were like, you shouldn't move to where you're moving because there's an active Klan there. And I'm like, well, I don't have a choice. It's where our house is, because again, my husband had no reason to look at when he was buying a house to look at whether or not that was an issue.
Yeah.
Because as white people, we don't ever think to say, is this place a place that's diverse enough where there isn't going to be a pushback?
Yeah.
And so when Black Lives Matter happened during the protests, I was in the pulpit and got some pushback from that. Not specifically because it was Black Lives Matter as much as it was just all lives matter. Again, there's this, or even trying to remind people from the pulpit that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are 48% not white. I would hear comments around like, well, this area is still white. And it's like, we have a lot of work to do at looking at how we treat people in the church. And our church, when the ELCA formed in 87 or 86 or 88, somewhere in those 80s, it was the widest church denomination. And it probably still is. We've really struggled with trying to not only overcome the racism in our churches, because most people, again, are very kind. They don't see themselves as racist and would be offended if I said some of them are. And a lot of it in trying to talk about these comments, it's challenging. And so one of the things the church has pastors do is take not only boundaries trainings, but also racial trainings. And in that training, again, you hear what a person of color goes through, where they put their hands out of the window to show the police they are not holding anything. They have a documents folder for whenever they get pulled over that is within reach. That's not in a glove compartment. Being white, because we don't see it, and you saw it more with the iPhones and everyone having an ability to record it,
Yep.
made it much more in our faces. It's taken us time. There are times where I wish more of the systemic training was done on racism and being sensitive to how to be an advocate for change was done by someone, was done for our churches. Like, because as the pastor, it's pushback if you try. It's like you're trying to agenda. It gets framed as you're political, you have an agenda, and it almost needs to be like someone coming out and talking about it. And I'm sure there are people who are willing to do this, but we don't always get, there's so many things that we're dealing with, we don't always get that, and that's one of the problems. The other one of the problems is not every congregation will take not only a woman pastor, but a pastor of color. And pastors of colors tend to have the longest wait for a call. And some of that is, you wouldn't knowingly put a person who is African American or Hispanic or of color in a congregation that is blatantly racist, because that's harmful to the pastor.
Yeah.
But getting people to look deep down and see, and even getting us to start putting up, like one suggestion was just start putting up pictures of Jesus that are not white, and using more ethnic pictures and stuff. And which reminds me of a story. So when I was in Germany, one of my travels, we were in a bunch of I loved going into the churches because you have the artwork, you have the stained glass. The historian in me is like, ooh, this goes from Romanesque to Gothic to, like I'm just like kid in a candy shop. But one of the tour guides was mentioning that you see these pictures of all of the people in the artwork, white European, dressed in middle-aged clothing. And they like to point out that the reason this is done is so that the people of the time realize the story was for them. Not just, but the people knew that that's not what Jesus looked like, or that's not, and we seem to have kind of forgotten that. Like, I think it's, at this point in time, it'd be more helpful for us to have pictures of Jesus that look Palestinian or Native American or African American, so that you see that this is more universal, and that, the form of Christianity is not a white person telling everyone what to do. I mean, the great Michelangelo created some fantastic pictures, but God is not a white old man. And Adam is not white. And Adam may not even be a person. Adam may just be simply an image for the creation of humanity. So, all of that stuff, we don't get a chance to really talk about in churches as much as we should.
One of the really eye-opening things for me was I listened to a podcast from Phil Vischer, the one of the creators of VeggieTales. And he did a whole episode on racism in America and the church. And it was the first time I really, a lot of things clicked. So like, I'm kind of very aware of housing and my dad was in real estate for a little bit, and driving around the area I live in, there's like these areas that are more lower economically, and they're like around highways and big towers for that are, and you're like, well, why is this? And he talked about redlining, and it was like, oh, well, I can see it. I can drive around the metropolitan area that I live in and see this thing he's talking about, where it happens, and it explains so much, because you're like, well, why would this happen? This would not normally happen. This would, like, you couldn't just go into a white community and put a highway through it, right? There'd be a lot of people screaming about that.
Yep.
But they got away. They did it because of racism and the legacy of that at the time. And then we, as white Christians that didn't understand what happened, are like, well, those people are there because they can't help. They're, like we're kind
They
of
want to
given
be
this.
there.
Yes. And so the ignorance around it reinforces this negative stereotype
Yeah.
towards those people that, like, well, the false idea that they couldn't help them, they didn't help themselves. And it was like, well, they couldn't. We created a system, we propped up a system that made that happen, and we're ignorant to it.
Yep.
And therefore we then blame them for something that wasn't their fault, that was our fault.
The attitude of blaming people for being caught in systems they did not choose is not consistent with Jesus' teachings and actions. The doctrine of discovery is not consistent with Jesus' teachings and actions. Denominations who have taken the step to renouncing the doctrine of discovery are also denouncing the attitude of white supremacy behind this doctrine. It is a first and necessary step toward bringing healing to populations who suffer greatly because of the generational trauma inflicted upon them by people claiming to follow Jesus. There is more that can be done. However, we need to be aware of the past to understand the present and change the future. Thank you for listening to our podcast. There is more to the conversation of racism and how churches can be allies and advocates for a more just society. If you want to be part of that conversation, drop us an email at condemnedhappy@gmail.com. You can connect with us online at Facebook as Condemned and Happy, or on Threads and Instagram as Condemned Happy, or you can check out our blogs on condemnedhappy.blogspot.com or condemnedhappy.wordpress.com. Thanks and have a great afternoon.